Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. Our guest is going to show how Donald Trump and his allies are following the same strategies that foreign leaders have used to gut their democracies and become autocrats.
Well, maybe Trump is consciously copying those autocrats, I wonder sometimes. Or maybe he's doing it out of instinct. But whichever it is, our guest says that Trump is using their playbook to attack America's democracy, step by step. Stephen Levitsky is professor of government at Harvard University. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, Steve. You and another Harvard professor wrote a book that came out 6 years ago called How Democracies Die, and it was and is chilling. Before we get into details about other countries and Trump, let me ask you today, are you feeling more optimistic about the future of America's democracy or less than when you wrote the book?
I hate to say it, but I'm feeling less optimistic, more concerned about the future of American democracy than when we wrote How Democracies Die. And the biggest difference is that when Trump was elected, the Republican Party still had a good number of small d Democrats in it. In fact, we looked at the Republican caucus in the Senate and even in the House at the time, and we're able to identify a bunch of Republicans who we believed would be able and willing to draw certain lines and to contain Trump. And maybe the biggest change in our politics over the last 6 years has been the rapid and thoroughgoing Trumpization of the Republican Party. And so now, whereas in 2018, when we wrote How Democracies Die, we were worried, very worried about an authoritarian president, we are now faced with an entire political party that has abandoned its commitment to democracy.
And, this is crucial because in your book, you really make a strong point that political parties in other countries that have faced extremist candidates have been the filters. They've actually prevented them from gaining power. And now you're saying that in the United States, that party which might be in a position to do that has abdicated that responsibility?
Yeah, it abdicated that responsibility in 2016. We held the Republicans responsible for failing to filter out Trump in 2016. We think that they abdicated their gatekeeping responsibility. But 2024 is very, very different. The 2024 Republican elites are not fretting about Trump. They are rushing to endorse Trump. There's not even any discussion of filtering him out. The party is behind him at this point, almost 100%.
Well, now it's spring of 2024. Trump is running for president again. And we want you to describe some of the specific strategies that foreign leaders have used to wreck their own democracies and make their countries autocratic. And of course, as we talk about this, we'll be thinking about Trump and the Republican Party. But before we go there, remind us, please, what is at stake here? Can you define democracy sort of briefly?
Well, I will define democracy as political scientists define democracy. In the modern world, over the last century or so, the political systems that we political scientists call democracies are political systems that hold regular, free and fair elections in which all or nearly all adults can vote, and in which citizens enjoy a broad array of individual liberties that allow themselves to inform themselves about the government, to criticize the government, and when necessary, to remove the government. So it's full suffrage, regular free elections, and a broad array of individual liberties.
And that implies that elections are not enough, that
right.
Democracy needs a strong, stable institutions, traditions of, say, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, even cultural attributes such as shared values among broad sweeps of the population, right?
Those things help, to be sure. There are democracies we now know that have emerged and survived and even thrived in a range of different cultures, including some very difficult ones, like contemporary South Africa or Costa Rica after its little civil war in the 1940s. But certainly those things help.
And you and your colleague at Harvard have drawn up a kind of litmus test that you say if leaders don't follow 3 or 4 basic rules, then, well, there's not much hope for the democracy. Describe the litmus test, please.
In our more recent book, Tyranny of the Minority, we argue that small d democratic parties or small d democratic politicians must do 3 things. They must always accept the results of elections, win or lose. That's pretty basic. That's a cardinal rule of democracy, is accepting election results. Secondly, they must always unambiguously reject and renounce political violence. And third, they must always and unambiguously break ties with anti-democratic extremist forces. For a political party to be considered committed to democracy, it must always accept election results, always renounce violence, and always wash its hands of anti-democratic extremists.
So let's take a look at a few of the countries you've studied where a leader got elected democratically, and then they transformed their democracy into an autocracy, legally, with little or no violence. And as we go along, we'll compare them with what Trump has been doing in recent years. So let's start with an autocrat who Trump publicly praises over and over again, Viktor Orban in Hungary.
I was very honored as a man. Viktor Orban. Did anyone ever hear of him?
And let me just say here that we're going to be playing snippets of Trump throughout our discussion to illustrate ways in which he seems to emulate these foreign leaders we're talking about.
He's probably like one of the strongest leaders anywhere in the world. And he's the head of Hungary, and he runs it tough. Let me tell you, he runs it properly. He runs it strong.
That was Trump a few years ago.
Sure. Just to take a step back, as you noted, democracies don't die the way they used to die. In the 20th century, the most common way in which democracy would break down would be some kind of a violent seizure of power, a military coup like Franco in Spain or Pinochet in Chile. That happens occasionally in the world, but it's much, much less common. Far and away, the most common path to democratic breakdown or death is at the hands of an elected leader, an elected prime minister or elected president who uses the very law and the very institutions of democracy to undermine democracy itself. And Viktor Orban is one of many, many cases, but he has been, I think, the most spectacularly successful at this because he's done it without any bloodshed, without locking up any opponents. He's done it almost with clean hands.
Well, let's go back. Let's go back to his beginning, if we could, because he was elected in 2010, and he didn't shake things up right away, did he? He moved gradually, somewhat gradually.
Well, Orban is a strange guy because he was an important leader of the anti-communist democracy movement back in the late 1980s and served as prime minister a couple of decades ago in the late 90s, but then lost and transformed himself in the early 21st century in opposition into a more far-right politician we see today. So this was all a second act of his. And I don't fully understand what motivated him, but it appears that he didn't like losing power, and he won back power in 2010. His party, Fidesz, won a super majority in parliament in 2010 because the former governing party, the Socialists, had experienced a terrible scandal. So it was a very landslide election in which his party managed to win more than 2/3 of the seats in parliament. In Hungary, you can reform the constitution with 2/3 vote of a single parliamentary body. Fidesz and Orban did that almost immediately in 2010, 2011. They rewrote the constitution in ways that enabled Orban to do, in particular, the first thing that most elected autocrats do, which is gain control of those who have the power over the rule of law, those with power to investigate, who have the power to bring people up on charges, who have the power to convict and put people behind bars.
You're talking about prosecutors and judges and...
Yeah. In the case of Orban, I'm talking specifically about the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
He passed a law that lowered the retirement age and compelled all judges over that age immediately to step down, which created a huge number of vacancies that he was able to fill.
He was also very clever, I thought, He hated the Chief Justice, who he saw as an opponent. And so the legislature rewrote the rules so that you had to have at least 5 years experience as a judge to hold that position.
As a judge in Hungary. And this president of the Supreme Court had been a judge in the European Court of Justice. So he was a very, very experienced judge, but just had not served the years in Hungary. They wrote this law explicitly aimed at removing the president of the Supreme Court.
And his party and the legislature went along with this willingly?
Yes. Yeah. Orban had a very tight control over his party. That was not really an issue.
And do you think at that point, just to look at that particular moment, do you think it was clear to the legislators what they were doing, what was happening here, where they were headed ultimately by enacting these various measures?
The truth is I don't know because I haven't talked to any of these guys. I think the short answer is no. There is a process that politicians go through by which they learn how to justify their behavior, learn how to rationalize their behavior, and basically sell themselves a set of goods to be able to live with what they're doing. So politicians learn very quickly how to justify their behavior. And Hungary was not as polarized as the United States, but it was fairly polarized. This is just in the aftermath of the financial crisis. It's at a time when immigration rates in Europe are fairly high. And Orban he was able to paint his opponents as anti-Hungary, anti-religion, sort of threatening the very core values of traditional Hungarians.
We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections and will do anything possible.
If you come to believe that your political rivals don't just promise policies you disagree with, but threaten the core values of your nation, pose somehow an existential threat to your society, then you're willing to go along with things that you might ordinarily not go along with, right? If the other side poses an existential threat, then it might be worth using sort of any means necessary to stop them. And that's an ethno-nationalist strategy that Orban used very effectively and has become really the political weapon of choice for the far right across Western democracies.
And what else did he do? What other steps did Orban take then? You mentioned the judges, the prosecutors.
So Orban was a master at two or maybe three things. One, using the law in a politicized way. So you have a corruption agency, an anti-corruption agency, or a media regulation agency whose job it is to oversee corruption or to oversee behavior of that, whether media entities are conforming to regulations, etc. That exists in any democracy. What you do, the chapter in the authoritarian playbook on this suggests you pack those agencies with your loyalists, with your party allies, and you use those agencies to enforce the law, but to do it in a selective way. So you protect your friends and you crack down on, sometimes for petty offenses, on your rivals. When you begin to do that, media entities, businesses who potentially can be fined or taxed or investigated, they learn very quickly what the new rules of the game are, and they begin to behave accordingly.
And let me give an example from your book. Orban did not shut down media. It was much more subtle than that. For example, the media agency that you've just talked about that he packed with his cronies, they denied licenses to independent media companies they didn't like because of quote-unquote regulatory offenses. And you give an example. Do you remember this one?
They ran a program that was a couple of minutes too long, right?
They said it was going to be 45 minutes long on a forum, but it turned out to be 50 minutes. And something else that they did was they passed a law, again, from your book, outlawing coverage that was unbalanced or insulting or affronted public morality, and assessed fines of almost $1 million. So as you say, this had a chilling effect, and people didn't even want to go there.
So the media, again, nobody was arrested. Media were not shut down, but they began to self-censor for fear of punitive action. The other thing that Orban was masterful at doing was working behind the scenes, using the various mechanisms that control of the government gave him to get his friends in ownership positions in major media, through media takeovers, through buyouts. He was able to gain informal control. The government didn't expropriate private media, but Orban was able to get his friends in charge of the largest media conglomerates. And those media conglomerates basically shut speech or shut down opposition media in the entities that they controlled, the newspapers, the radio stations, etc.
These are just dishonest, terrible people. I'm telling you that. Terrible people. I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
That phrase, enemy of the people, is exactly the one used by Stalin as a criminal charge against Soviet citizens in the 20s and 30s to send them off to the Gulag and to firing squads. And also by the Nazis later.
Jews were the enemy of the German people.
And that's right, yeah. It's a familiar, to anyone who knows anything about dictatorships, the most horrible kind, it's a very familiar phrase.
And back to Hungary for a moment. So, the result of everything that Orban and his ruling party have done, which includes they've attacked the media, packed the courts, and gerrymandered, and we haven't talked about that. The result is that they've sometimes won less than half the vote, yet they control 2/3 of parliament, which is kind of like the United States in some ways.
It's similar to the manufactured supermajorities that we see in several U.S. states in particular. Yeah, another set of reforms that Orban pushed through the parliament further gerrymandered the system. And so a couple of elections in a row, Fidesz did not win a majority and yet won a supermajority in the parliament. So it's able to single-handedly rewrite the rules of the game.
So Orban was elected in 2010, and here he is 14 years later, still very much the leader or ruler, depending on your word choice, of Hungary. And Trump loves him so much. The first clip we heard of Trump talking about Orban was from some years ago. So let's play something that Trump said just a few weeks ago. This Orban flew to Mar-a-Lago, Trump's Florida estate, brought flowers to Melania. And here's what Trump said to the adoring crowd. The audio quality is pretty bad. Somebody took this from the crowd with a mobile phone.
There's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. He's fantastic. As you know, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and does a great job. He's a non-controversial figure because he said this is the way it's going to be, and that's the end of it, right? He's the boss.
So in case you had trouble understanding, he said this: there's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. He's fantastic. He does a great job. He's a non-controversial figure because he said, this is the way it's going to be, and that's the end of it, right? He's the boss. So let me ask you, Steve, about another area. We've talked a lot about government, but the universities also were Orban's targets. What did he do with universities, and how does that compare to what DeSantis has done in Florida, Governor DeSantis?
Oh, it's frighteningly parallel. I think Ron DeSantis is a much more Orban-like figure than Trump, and you've seen him, and his government in Florida really has a number of parallels with Hungary. Trump is more, at least Trump on his own, reminds me more of an old 20th century tin pot dictator. He has very, very base authoritarian instincts. He thinks every government agency, every state agency is there for his personal use. He would have governed mid 20th century Nicaragua very well.
We shouldn't laugh. It's really sad.
But Hungary was a pretty solid democracy. It's in the middle of Europe. One can't be a tin pot dictator in Hungary. And so if Orban is going to establish some sort of authoritarian rule, he's going to have to do it legally and subtly. But he has very effectively wielded the machinery of government against his political rivals. And he did that maybe most importantly or most effectively against the European University, which was a bastion of, as universities are, a bastion of independent thought. A very, very high-profile university. Nobody imagined that the government could ever shut down the European University. He treated the university as somehow anti-Hungarian, subversive, against the mainstream cultural values of Hungary, and he bullied it into fleeing the country.
It raises the question about Hungary because you called it a solid democracy, but it doesn't have a long tradition of democracy, does it? I mean, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, following World War I, it had a communist government, then it had a right-wing authoritarian government, and then, of course, following World War II, for nearly half a century, it was a communist government. So my question is, does that make a difference? I mean, how important is it not to have that very long tradition of democratic institutions and norms?
Let me flip that around a little bit and say it definitely helps to have a long history of democracy. There's a lot of empirical evidence that one of the best predictors of democratic survival is the age of your democracy, the number of years you've lived under democracy. Now, that puts Hungary kind of in the middle of the pack because Hungary, it's true, it had almost no democratic history prior to 1989. But between 1989 and 2010, it had 21 years of full, solid, stable democracy. And by most accounts, thanks in part to close ties to the European Union, had developed fairly robust democratic institutions. There are literally dozens of democracies that were born over the last 40 years that were born in countries with very different cultures, very diverse cultures, and with no democratic past. South Korea and Taiwan had no democratic history. South Africa had no democratic history. Ghana had no democratic history. Romania and Bulgaria had even less of a democratic tradition than Hungary, and yet they're democracies with problems. So it's certainly not necessary to have a long democratic tradition like, the UK. A fairly large number of democracies have been built more or less from scratch since the early 1980s.
Just to remind our listeners, we're speaking with Stephen Levitsky, who is a professor of government at Harvard and who is a co-author of a book that is enough to chill your bones called How Democracies Die.
Let's go back in a moment to the United States and what Trump and the Republican Party are doing to it. But first, let's touch on one more country. Interestingly, Trump has publicly attacked their government, but in many ways, he's very similar to their former leader, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. What are a few things that Trump has been doing that echo what Chavez did? Chavez came in, people left him off as a clown, right? Nobody took him seriously, just as they did Trump, and then look what happened.
I think that's right. Chavez was badly underestimated. Chavez actually came from the military, unlike Trump, and led a serious military coup attempt in 1992, several years before he was elected, and was imprisoned for that failed coup attempt. But he was pardoned. He was let out of prison precisely because the president at the time kind of viewed him as a clown and didn't take him seriously. And then 4 years after being let out of prison, he was elected president. What Chavez did that is very similar to Trump is deliberately polarize. He constantly cast all of his opponents as enemies of Venezuela, enemies of the people, traitors, and constantly used language to describe his rivals as people who were beyond the pale, people who posed an existential threat and could not be accepted. And that helped to create an environment that justified or legitimized bullying and sort of tilting the political playing field against these so-called enemies or traitors to Venezuela. And that language, although Hugo Chavez came from the left and Trump comes from the right, their language, particularly in the way they depict their political rivals, is very, very similar.
Joe Biden is a low IQ individual, and he is truly the worst, most incompetent, and most corrupt president in the history of the United States. It's a disgrace what's going on with our country.
So what were Chavez's specific tactics?
Again, in many ways similar to Orban's.
Of course, Chavez went after the media in Venezuela, a lot like Orban did in Hungary. And based on what I've read in your book, it seems like Chavez was kind of clever about it.
Yes, clever, a little less subtle than Orban, however. I mean, whereas Orban was really skilled in basically bringing the private media on board by attacking it with his allies. Chavez, in a couple of important cases, was more openly bullying, closing down a major television network on legal grounds, using the regulatory agency to deny the television station a renewal of its license. So it seemed at some level legal. But he actually shut down a major television station, RCTV. He also bullied the owner of another major television station, Globovisión, through tax and fraud investigations. He basically led the owner of the TV station to flee the country to avoid jail and then eventually sell the media company to a pro-Chavez businessman. So Chavez was a little more heavy-handed than Orban was, but the end result was the same, a private media that was completely compliant and aligned with the Chavista government.
Speaking of what Trump might try to do if he got reelected, among other things, listen to how Trump was threatening the media a few years ago before Twitter got taken over by his richest supporter, Elon Musk.
Well, the president this morning is threatening to shut down or, quote, strongly regulate social media platforms. This is, of course, after Twitter fact-checked two of his false tweets on mail-in ballots. The president claims they're trying to silence conservatives' voices.
One of the keys for all elected autocrats is to gain control over the referees, the judges, the courts, the prosecutors, electoral authorities, any agencies with the power to adjudicate disputes and to potentially punish rivals.
Chavez packed the Supreme Court.
He packed the Supreme Court twice.
And I think it's worth reminding everybody that during the Obama administration, the Republican Senate refused to even consider Obama's final attempt to appoint a Supreme Court justice. They wouldn't even have hearings on the guy, Merrick Garland, which was, am I right, the first time in American history that has ever happened?
It's the first time since Reconstruction, I think since 1866.
And that paved the way for Trump when he got elected to pack the Supreme Court.
And also in 2020, just less than 2 months before the election, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, the Republican-controlled Senate reversed its position and rushed through a nominee so Trump could have that chance also to put his justice, in this case, Amy Coney Barrett, on the court.
And we should also briefly mention that the Heritage Foundation, which is not the Trump campaign, but they're very influential. They supply a lot of the advisors to Trump. They supply a lot of top officials in his past administration. They've come out with a blueprint called Project 2025, saying this is what they think Trump, if he's reelected, should do this time to run the government much more effectively. And one of the big things they talked about was Trump didn't do a good enough job packing the courts and the federal agencies with people who were loyal to him. So they've proposed a plan that would basically get rid of up to 50,000 civil servants and replace them with people who pass the Trump test and are specially trained to carry out Trump's ideology.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to go back and realize that nobody was prepared for 2016. Trump didn't think he was going to win. Trump had no plan. He had no team. He had no experience. He really had no idea what he was doing.
That was the saving grace of Trump.
In many senses, yes. I mean, it had terrible costs in terms of governance, but in terms of democracy, he was able to do less damage. Quite simply, he had not read the authoritarian playbook when he took office in 2017. He still hasn't read anything. He's still disorganized, but he learned through experience what he needs to do. He realized he can't rely on establishment figures to govern. If he wants to get what he wants done, he's going to have to purge the administration and pack it with loyalists. He's very clear on that. He's learned that he can then use those agencies, once they're packed, as weapons against his rivals. He has said as much. And so he's much, much more prepared to govern like an authoritarian this time around.
In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today I add, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
The other thing that's happened is other actors in American society have caught up with him. I mean, Trump is successful, And he doesn't have an ideology. He doesn't have a plan. But anytime somebody with a lot of power and a lot of public support moves in a particular direction, you're going to find people taking advantage of that and trying to build an ideology around him and build a project around him. And the Heritage Foundation, which used to be a sort of mainstream free market think tank, has converted to Trumpism because that seems to be the way of the future. And so they have come up with a plan that is completely consistent with Trump's aims. But it's really important to point out that the authoritarian right in general, the Republicans in general, have come around to a very authoritarian view, and Orban is the model in this, that the government, the machinery of government, should be politicized and wielded against our rivals. This is consistent with this so-called deep state ideology. It's consistent with a view that the left has somehow infiltrated institutions across the United States, and that the right needs to purge both societal and state institutions of these leftist elements in order to sort of get what it wants. That's what Orban did. That's what DeSantis has toyed with doing in Florida. And that's what Heritage proposes that Trump do in the United States.
And this is not the traditional conservative small government view at all. This is the opposite of, mobilizing big government, in effect, to...
Very much so. It is a major, major ideological turn. It's much more statist, much less market-oriented, and much more authoritarian.
And it looks as if Trump has surrounded himself so far, or will, if he gets into office, with people who are pretty skilled in implementing this whole ideological transformation, unlike the first term.
Well, he will surround himself with people who are committed to doing that, who have a plan, who have a set of coherent goals, and are committed to doing that. I'm not sure how experienced or how skilled they'll be, but they'll, unlike the first time when he was surrounded himself mostly with mainstream and establishment Republicans, he will surround himself with loyalists who are willing to do his bidding and who are aiming to carry out this purge of the state.
I pray that we not use the future tense he will. Let's say he would if elected. So we have seen and heard ways that Trump has already over the years been copying these tactics in Hungary and Venezuela, and you write about other countries in your book, packing the courts.
A New York State judge just ruled, and he's crooked as you could get.
Packing prosecutors' offices.
We have a totally corrupt attorney general. Letitia James, she's a horribly corrupt attorney general.
Gerrymandering, attacking his political enemies. I mean, we could go on and on. So, Steve, I'm completely depressed. The one thing in your books that makes me not 100% hopeless is that you say there have been examples in recent years of political courage around the world, where countries that could have gone, that seem to be going crazy right extremists like Trump, political leaders said, wait a minute, we don't want to go there. Could you give us an example to leave us with a sense of recent history?
In recent history? In recent history, I would point, I guess, to three cases. One of them is Brazil, where Jair Bolsonaro is in many ways a replica of Donald Trump. He's an admirer of Trump who in many ways copied Trump. He was elected president of Brazil 2 years after Trump. The U.S. media called him the Trump of the tropics. Very, very similar government, failed pretty badly during the pandemic, narrowly lost re-election, and we're discovering now, attempted to overturn the election. Somewhat different strategy than Trump. And in fact, he fomented a January 6th-like event on January 8th, 2023 in Brazil, in which protesters stormed not only Congress, but the Supreme Court and the presidency. And so very similar case, but the cases diverge a lot because right-wing politicians in Brazil behaved a lot better than right-wing politicians in the United States. So when Bolsonaro narrowly lost his reelection in October 2022, right-wing allies of Bolsonaro accepted the results of the election on election night. They said, too bad, we lost. We look forward to working with new President Lula. When the January 8th uprising occurred in Brazil, it was denounced by right-wing politicians. Mm-hmm. Right-wing politicians, unlike the United States, pushed for an investigation into the uprising. Nobody called those who were arrested hostages. Nobody downplayed the uprising. They all condemned it, which is what you're supposed to do. And then when Bolsonaro, when the courts banned Bolsonaro from participating in politics for 8 years, Brazilians accepted that. Even Brazilian right-wing politicians accepted that. And so whereas Trump is on the brink of returning to the presidency, in Brazil, Bolsonaro is out of politics, and he still has a lot of support, but he's been basically marginalized from the political process. So there was another path in the United States. Right-wing politicians just didn't follow that path. Another case that's worth paying attention to is Poland, where you had an Orban-like government, never quite as authoritarian, never quite as powerful as Orban, but a fairly illiberal right-wing government for many years that was defeated in elections in 2023 because opposition forces from the left to the right forged a broad coalition against the authoritarians. And that's another important lesson for the United States, that there has to be, if Trumpism is going to be defeated, a cooperation among all small d democratic forces in the United States, ranging from left-wing politicians all the way to the right, to right-wing business people, right-wing religious figures, right, and all conservative politicians willing to join the opposition. And that's what happened in Poland, and it worked.
And in Austria, too, the conservatives kind of rallied and stopped extremists from gaining power.
This was the second round of an Austrian presidential election in which a far-right candidate and a Green Party candidate made it to the runoff, and the mainstream conservatives made this very difficult decision to back the Green candidate, because even though they disagreed with the Greens ideologically or policy-wise, the Green candidate was at least committed to democracy.
And I want to quote something you wrote in your book about that extraordinary decision that Conservative Party leaders made in Austria less than 10 years ago. They explained that they were joining forces with their opponents in the Green Party, quote, not with passion, but after careful deliberation, unquote. And basically, here was their deliberation. They said, and I'm quoting again, "We don't want congratulations from extremist leaders in other countries," unquote, if we win by joining forces with extremists here in Austria. In other words, they supported their political opponents to protect democracy.
So, Steve, what's the chance that Republican leaders in the U.S. will turn against Trump in order to protect America's democracy? Party leaders turned against extremists in the past. For example, the Democratic leaders turned against George Wallace in the 1960s. He was, of course, the infamous racist governor of Alabama. Republican leaders turned against Henry Ford in the 1930s. Younger listeners might not know that Ford didn't just create the Ford Motor Company. He was pro-Hitler and anti-Semitic, and lots of people thought he should run for president. He was very popular, actually.
Some points we don't learn very much in history.
Yeah, well, from reading your books, I guess you're not optimistic that many Republicans today would show that kind of courage that some Republicans and other party leaders showed back then.
The difference between now and then is that our parties are much more polarized, and the Republican Party in particular has radicalized. I mean, even relative to the Reagan era, this has become an extremist party. There are comparative studies that show that ideologically, whereas 40 years ago, the Republican Party lined up more or less close to the Tories, say, in Great Britain, or the Christian Democrats in Germany, ideologically, the Republican Party is closer to far-right parties in Europe than it is to conservative parties in Europe. And that's another reason why they're willing to support Trump. This is an extraordinarily radical party.
And, as you've written, Steve, the test is also, after the would-be autocrat gets into power, how much stress and strain the democratic institutions and norms can take, and whether, in our case, if Trump is elected, whether, the restraints and the checks and the balances that are built into the system and in the agencies of the executive branch and so forth, and the courts, how much resistance they will put up to what we see as Trump's burgeoning authoritarianism along the ideological lines that you've described.
Let me ask another version of that question. Supposing Trump loses in November of 2024 this year, people will celebrate, people who love democracy, but does that mean we can relax? I mean, to what extent will you continue to worry about the fate of American democracy?
Well, first of all, I think we will be much better off as a democracy if Trump loses than if he wins. He can do much, much more damage if he controls the levers of power in ways that we discussed than if he loses. So for democracy's sake, it would be a very good thing if he loses. No matter who wins the November election, anybody who's concerned about democracy is going to have to wake up the next morning and continue to struggle for democracy. If Trump wins, it's not true that the game is up, that fascism is upon us and we've got to just give up. No, it's going to be a struggle. That democratic forces, democratic institutions are pretty strong in this country. And so it's not going to be easy for Trump to push those institutions aside, which means that people have a role. People are going to have to fight to defend democracy. This is also true if Trump loses. I think he'll do less damage. I think, this talk of a bloodbath or another Stop the Steal or violence, I mean, there may well be some of it, but I think our system is much more likely to survive even a major temper tantrum by Trump and his supporters than if he wins. It's going to be a while, though. Trumpism is a phenomenon that has the support of a little over a third of this country. It's a primary winning majority of the Republican Party. Unfortunately, a majority of Republicans today hold extremist beliefs, and that's not going to change immediately. Even if Trump were to retire to Mar-a-Lago, I think the Republican Party is not going back to the party of Mitt Romney or Nikki Haley. It'll be a Trump-like figure who succeeds him, I think, most likely. And so the Democratic problem will not be resolved in November 2024. Preserving democracy is a full-time, permanent struggle, and getting the United States back to a place where democracy is relatively stable and both political parties are playing by democratic rules, that's going to take, hard to say, at least a decade or so.
Well, Dave, can we say thanks and let Steve go?
Yes. Well, thanks to Stephen Levitsky, professor of government at Harvard. Steve, this was really illuminating, depressing, but also energizing for anybody who wants to preserve American democracy and understands how we have to keep fighting. Thank you.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks to both of you for having me on. It was a great discussion.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.